The Royal Navy after the 1940s was generally a shadow of its former self. A lack of funding and a poor economic situation conspiring to shrink the fleet, along with, it must be said, some poor political decision making. Regardless, nowhere was this more evident than the aircraft carrier fleet. I've touched on this before with the rebuild of HMS Victorious. In today's video, we'll return to that topic, with HMS Eagle, one of the largest carriers ever built by the British, and one with an unfortunate end to her story. But, of course, that comes later. First, let's look at where that story began. In this case, as one of the last fleet carriers built for the Royal Navy, the Audacious class beginning its life as a larger follow-up on Implacable, although that would prove short-lived as multiple changes were made to the design. Implacable, while an improvement on Illustrious, was still a limited design. The Royal Navy elected to move past that with Audacious, from an improved Implacable to an almost clean slate. These improvements would largely focus on aircraft operation. In fact, a lot of features of this design were an outgrowth from one concept, that being an increase in the height of the hangar. On Implacable, this had been 14 feet. Perfectly fine when designed, but aircraft were rapidly increasing in size. As a result, the height was extended to 17 feet and 6 inches. This change might seem fairly minor, just a couple feet of extra height. However, the changes radiated out from there. The increased height required a deeper hull, in this case by 6 feet, which in turn required an increase of 4 feet to the beam, in an effort to maintain stability, all of which added up to a much higher displacement, from a standard load of 27,000 tons up to 32,000 tons. This increase in size allowed for other changes. For instance, separating out the propulsion rooms, with 2 different groupings, each group consisting of 2 boiler rooms, 2 engine rooms, and 2 gear rooms, with those kept well away from each other to improve survivability. Further changes came to the aircraft handling. The elevators were made larger and stronger to handle larger aircraft. Similarly, the bomb magazines were expanded and the bomb lifts strengthened. Fuel storage was also improved. In addition, the ship also picked up an extensive set of arrestor gear, 16 wires, and 4 safety barriers. This, coupled with American-style catapults, made for excellent aircraft handling. Finally, Audacious also gained a massive island superstructure. This gave more space for the crew to spread out and work, improving operations there, as well as giving more space for an extensive radar suite. All of these changes resulted in a ship that was, for the 1940s, quite advanced and capable, although a ship that lingered so long in construction and redesign that she finished late. We'll get to that later. Although, one note before we move on. This ship was laid down as Audacious, the first of her class. The third ship of the class, meanwhile, was laid down as Eagle. That ship, only 26% complete, was canceled at the end of 1945. Audacious would then be renamed to Eagle on January 21st, 1946, to keep the name going in the Royal Navy. And now we'll do a brief rundown of the design detail. We'll begin, as always, with displacement. Eagle displaced around 37,400 tons at her standard displacement, which, if you'll note, is even heavier than planned, with this increasing to 46,700 tons when fully loaded. On that displacement, Eagle came out to 803 feet, or 245 meters in length, allowing for a flight deck of 800 feet or 244 meters. This flight deck was serviced by two elevators, both mounted on the centerline, in typical fashion for what was, in the end, a mid-1940s design. And in typical British fashion, that flight deck was heavily armored, ranging from 1 to 4 inches or 25 to 102 millimeters. Eagle featured a similarly thick armor belt of 4 inches in thickness. As for defensive weaponry, that also followed the pattern. 8 twin mounts for the 4.5-inch, 114mm gun. These were carried in sponsons by the flight deck. 2 pairs with 1 set on the bow and 1 set on the stern. To back those up, Eagle also carried a positively American level of light anti-aircraft weaponry. 61 40mm Bofors guns. All of this could reach 31 knots on 152,000 shaft horsepower, although a more typical speed was around 30 knots. And to round things off, the ship could carry anywhere from 60 to 80 aircraft, between a deck park and her 2 hangars. And with that, we finished off this section. Now let's talk service history, at least until we reach the first major refit. This began when the ship was laid down, on October 24th, 1942, by Harland and Wolff. Her construction would progress rather slowly for 2 main reasons. First, material and manpower shortages, and second, because of the constant changes to the design. As a result, Eagle only launched on March 19th of 1946, christened by no less than Princess, later Queen Elizabeth. And the ship was only completed several years later on October 1st of 1951, with her commissioning following on March 1st, 1952. Quite a long and drawn-out process, especially as the ship came out in more or less her original design, compared to her sister Ark Royal, where more design changes were built in. In any event, Eagle joined up with the Royal Navy. As you could probably guess, her service was largely quiet. The British mostly avoided naval conflict, at least during Eagle's service. That meant the ship mostly missed actual combat. For example, she commissioned too late for Korean service. Although there is one notable exception that we'll see later. First, Eagle began her service with a major naval exercise, Operation Mainbrace, in September 1952. This wasn't just Eagle's first major exercise, but the first NATO one in general. 80,000 men, over 200 ships, and 1,000 aircraft. It was not a small event by any stretch of the imagination. The next major event after this was the coronation review for Queen Elizabeth. That took place in June 1953. When that was done, Eagle spent the next year between Britain and the Mediterranean, primarily on typical training duty. Nothing particularly surprising. If there is anything surprising about this period, it's how little time the ship spent in her original design. Eagle was in for a fairly extensive rebuild in June 1954, a rebuild that lasted until February 1955. The most visually distinctive change being an angled flight deck, specifically a deck angled to 5.5 degrees. Or 4 degrees according to Hobbs. A relatively minor change, but one that could be done without major structural work. With her new deck, Eagle worked back up before rejoining the Mediterranean fleet. This would be where she spent most of the next 2 years, although not much happened during 1955, or early 1956 for that matter. Eagle continued on her rotation of training and exercises. one of which in June 1956 involved testing the air defenses of Malta. That was Operation Malt X. Beyond exercises like that and a short refit, there isn't much of note. This would change rather drastically in November of 1956. Operation Musketeer between November 1st and November 6th. This was the military portion of the Suez Crisis, a joint Anglo-French operation, also mostly out of the scope for this video. As far as Eagle is concerned, her first actual combat was a success. Despite being down a catapult due to malfunctions, the carrier launched no fewer than 621 sorties. This was notably more than any other carrier involved. Her crew and pilots seemed to do their duty well. Regardless, with the overall failure on the political side, Eagle left the area. She would return to more typical training for the rest of the 1950s. There would be no more active combat in this decade, although there would be a couple breaks in the pattern beyond just refits. For example, when Eagle's pilots escorted troops from Cyprus to Jordan in July 1958 to protect Lebanon and Jordan from potential Iraqi aggression, again according to Hobbs. The other notable incident took place in the same year. Eagle shifted to the Libyan coast in September 1958 for joint exercises with the Libyan army. When that was done, Eagle spent a few more months on training before she returned home by May of 1959, where the carrier would go in for her most extensive rebuild. Not quite to the extent that HMS Victorious went through, but still quite a lot of work. Once more, a large focus was put on the flight deck. The angled deck was extended out to 8.5 degrees. This was matched by moving one of the catapults to the angled deck. In direct contrast to American rebuilds, Eagle would retain both her centerline lifts. With her double hangar design, a side elevator could only service the upper hangar. There were also issues with a side elevator built into Ark Royal's design, so the British stuck with the classic, although the elevators were strengthened to carry up to 40,000 pounds. There were further modifications made to the deck, newer resting wires being one of them, and the ship also gained jet blast deflectors for the catapults. However, those were plain metal, fine for most aircraft of the period, but notably not for F-4 Phantoms, which would have melted anything without water cooling. That will be important later. For now, there are two notable bits left. First, the island. Eagle had her old island torn off and replaced by a new one. This was better laid out for modern radar, even more so than Victorious. The ship would come out with the most advanced combat control in the Royal Navy. Unfortunately, the other notable bit is her power supply. Eagle had to make do with a mix of DC and AC generators due to her age. It was too expensive to rewire the ship. The same went for her power plant, with the old boilers remaining in place, overhauled and refurbished, but not replaced like on Vicky. Finally, Eagle lost her bow-mounted 4.5-inch guns, as well as the Bofors. Instead, she would retain her stern guns, along with 6 Sea-Cat missile launchers. All of this work pushed her displacement up to around 51,000 to 54,000 tons, again depending on source. This rebuild would complete in May 1964 at a cost of £31 million, at which point Eagle returned to service as the largest aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy, although her post-refit service would be mostly uneventful. Not entirely without incident, of course, but also not terribly different to her prior service. There were two main differences. First, in a new locale. Most of her post-refit time was spent in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. As for the second point, a good bit of time was spent on acting in support of British interests. For example, her first major action came in keeping an eye on Indonesia in 1965, during the confrontation over the creation of Malaysia. While certainly a tense time in history, Eagle wouldn't directly contribute, other than as a show of force alongside Victorious. This took place over March and April of 1965. And then in November, Eagle moved off the African coast. After Rhodesia declared independence, the ship was dispatched as a precaution. Although, once again, this wouldn't come to anything. Instead, Eagle returned home, before sailing back to the Indian Ocean in 1966, for what turned out to be a long year. Over the course of this year, Eagle supported operations in Aden and the blockade of Rhodesia. The operations off Aden took place at the start of the year, while the blockade off Africa took place from March 5th to May 4th. 1967, meanwhile, would be less exciting. For a good chunk of the year, Eagle remained off Aden to support the British withdrawal from what would become South Yemen. This would be the last major role for the aircraft carrier. 1968 through 1972 was mostly spent on exercises, with a couple exceptions, such as another tour off Yemen in April 1968, or landing trials of Phantoms in 1969, which were largely successful. However, by 1972, the British had decided to retire Eagle. Most sources, Hobbs included, will cite this as a political decision. The British government decided to save money, and Eagle was a victim, despite evidently being in better material condition than Ark Royal. It was apparently too expensive to refit Eagle to operate Phantoms, although the most notable change there was simply better blast deflectors. Regardless, Eagle was put in reserve and used as a parts donor for her sister ship until finally being sold for scrap on October 14th, 1978. By which point, Hobbs has this to say about her condition. On inspection, however, the unmaintained flight deck was found to be badly corroded, with grass growing on it, and the interior of the hull was in poor condition. A sad end for what was arguably one of the best Royal Navy aircraft carriers. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.